Howdy do, folks. Look, it's me and Jacob.
It's us.
We're back for the second episode of the day. Glad to be here. Jacob doesn't seem to be so glad.
I'm looking forward to our discussion.
Good.
Yeah, this is something I've been thinking about for some time. And so it's nice to kind of, have the conversation.
I agree. Well, we got 15 of you in here already. Cool. Glad to have you all. Today we're talking about the ultimate guide to dry fire safety. We've talked about various concepts we're about to discuss before, maybe even focused on some of them somewhat in some episodes, but bringing it all together with our current approach to dry fire safety. So glad you suggested it. Well, hello, Clyde. Thanks for joining on YouTube. Good evening. Glad to have you. Folks, feel free to chime in, comment, ask questions. We'll address those questions we're able to, or as long as they're reasonably relevant to today's content. Let us know where you're watching or viewing or listening from. Always glad to meet new folks and have many of you from all across the country tuning in. And in case this is the first time you're doing so, just know that the audio recordings of each podcast episode is uploaded and published to our podcast channel, I guess, which is available on all of the major podcast platforms. Apple, Google, Audible, Spotify. There's not a big one I'm missing. What's that?
All of them.
Yeah. All of them that we are aware of, or that we can keep track of anyway. So, well, let's get it started. Here we go.
Roll.
In 3, 2, 1. This is the Concealed Carry Podcast, Season 6, Episode 2. And welcome to the Concealed Carry Podcast, brought to you by Mountain Man Medical, part of the concealedcarry.com network of podcasts. Today is Thursday, April 7th, 2022. I am your host, Riley Bowman, and I'm joined today by Jacob Paulsen.
I'm here. Thanks
no
for the
fancy
invite.
fanfare for you today.
That's right.
No special title, nothing.
Just
other than he's the
Jacob.
Man with a very cool but sometimes finicky dog.
He'd rather me be playing with him right now than doing this podcast.
Yeah. One thing we know for sure, folks, I say this as a deterrent. Don't ever try to break into Jacob's house. Not just because he has guns, but because he has a dog. I guarantee you will let him know that you are there.
Very sensitive.
I've known this dog since he was a pup, and he still freaks out every time I show up.
He's a big boy. He's not a pup anymore.
Today, we are talking about the ultimate guide to dry fire safety. We're going to give you our current approach to dry fire safety, which we think is a very important topic of discussion. I think we've covered a lot of these different things, sometimes in parts and pieces and bits here and there. But also things change and evolve, and we get better over time and learn. Well, we learn from mistakes. Hopefully this is not one of those areas that we learn from very serious, direct mistake of, firing off rounds when we shouldn't be in certain places. So we're going to give you our ultimate guide to dry fire safety. Bunch of tips, tricks, suggestions, recommended policies and procedures, but also tools that can help increase your dry fire safety practice as well. So today's episode was sponsored by Gunfighter Gun Oil. Guys, I've been using Gunfighter Gun Oil for some time now, and I have nothing bad to say about it. I have only good. I'll say this much. We just had breakfast last week, Jacob and I, with the current owner of Gunfighter Gun Oil, and that's Mickey Shook of Carry Trainer. And Mickey's an awesome dude. I have nothing bad to say about him.
I'm a fan.
Only good. We've been friends with Mickey for some time now, and I'll tell you, there's not a bigger patriot than Mickey Shook. And not only that, there almost isn't a more generous person than Mickey Shook. He's always been so kind and so good to us. Every time we associate with him, he thinks of things too that just sometimes just surprise me. That's the kind of character of a man that's behind Gunfighter Gun Oil. He cares about the product. He cares about making a quality product. He cares that it works. And I do too. And all my guns run on Gunfighter Gun Oil and are cleaned with Gunfighter Gun Oil products. Check them out. Go to gunfighteroil.com today. And yeah, I hope you give them a try. It's also available on our website. And also, Gunfighter Gun Oil is a sponsor of the Guardian Conference, and Mickey will be there too as one of our instructors, one of our featured instructors, which is really, really cool. He doesn't do that just for anybody, as we found out.
That's right.
Also, today's episode sponsored by Ready Up Gear Dummy Ammo. This is my preferred dummy ammo of choice. In fact, I've got some sitting on my competition belt and some magazines right over my shoulder here. Was just doing some dry fire practice last night. I love the Ready Up Gear dummy ammo because, number one, it's very cost effective. Okay. Having bought many different types of brands of dummy ammo over the years, it's very affordably priced, very reasonably priced for a quality product. These use actual brass cases, okay, that is then filled with a special silicone-like polymer, but it's harder than that.
Polymer bicarbonate or something like that.
What's that?
I think it's like polymer bicarbonate, or I don't know. It's
polymer bicarbonate. That sounds fancy.
That sounds possible, like what I remember. Yeah.
But it's good stuff, man. So it won't hurt. It won't harm your gun. It's brightly colored, so you know it's a dummy round. That polymer fills all the way from the primer cup all the way through the case, and of course the tip is formed just like the standard shape of a FMJ bullet profile. So that's what I use. They have a decent weight to them. They're not quite as heavy as an actual round would be, but they have some. When I load a magazine for dry fire practice with these, it has pretty realistic heft to it. I appreciate that. It's great for dry fire practice. It's safe. It's quality stuff. Lasts a long time, longer than any of the other dry fire ammo I've used in the past. So I appreciate that, and I encourage you to check out Ready Up Gear dummy ammo today at readyupgear.com. Of course, today's topic is dry fire focused, and that is a dry fire specific product. And even if you are just doing dry fire practice, maybe you're not getting your guns as dirty as normal, but still consider using Gunfire Gun Oil to keep things in tip-top shape. So let's get into a topic. The ultimate guide to dry fire safety. I don't know. You recommended this, Jacob. It was your suggestion. You came to the table with some ideas. I have my responses. I suspect that there may be some things that we have slightly different opinions on, which is always a good thing. Provides a good opportunity for discussion. So where should we start? Where do we begin?
I think there's a mindset issue. I think that we start there before we get into anything more practical or tangible. I think in my experience, there's a tendency when the topic comes up of NDs, negligent discharges, there's a tendency for our mind to associate the idea of an ND with an irresponsible gun owner. And by what I mean by irresponsible gun owner is somebody who we clearly don't think that we would do what they did, right? Like, so somebody who's keeping a gun in a sock drawer, or it's bouncing around in the glove box of the car, or they're cleaning a shotgun and they look down the barrel to see if there's anything in it. Things that are just grossly unsafe and irresponsible. Things that anyone listening to this podcast would never do. If you're the kind of person who would listen to this podcast, you would never do any of those grossly irresponsible things. But I think that when we talk about NDs, there's a tendency in our noggin, in our 8-pound gray matter, to associate NDs with those gun owners, with those irresponsible types, for a couple of reasons. I think one, it certainly probably is statistically validated. A large number of NDs that we hear about, that we're aware of, do tend to come from those irresponsible gun owners, from people doing things that I would never do. That I really wouldn't. Like, I wouldn't keep my gun in my sock drawer. I wouldn't do that. I wouldn't have my loaded rifle in the back of the truck where my dog's running around and he steps on the trigger. That's happened at least twice that I know of. I've seen the news stories. So like that, statistically speaking, we tend to associate NDs with irresponsibility, because I think the majority of them we hear about, that's where they happen. I also think we do it because it makes us feel better about ourselves. It's a principle of dissonance, right? Of cognitive dissonance. Like, well, if I associate negligent discharges at large with irresponsible gun use and irresponsible gun ownership, then it makes me feel more comfortable about myself and my gun ownership, because it's less scary. I don't have to consider that it might happen to me, because I don't do those dumb things that those other people are doing when they have these negligent discharges. So I think the place we need to start this conversation is with an acceptance that guns are potentially dangerous tools, and all of us are vulnerable. And if you've been doing this long enough, professionals, let alone just your average responsible gun owner, but straight up true professionals that have had negligent discharges, people who I think are highly respectable and credible. So it happens.
Absolutely. No, it's a very real thing. It's a very real possibility for any of us. 100%. I couldn't agree more with that point that you just made. So I think what you're suggesting is us being honest with ourselves and recognizing or accepting the fact that myself, you, every one of you listening to this or viewing this right now are all, I don't know if capable is my best.
We're all vulnerable.
Choice. We're all, we are all vulnerable to having a lapse of reason, of judgment, of whatever it is, and making a mistake with respect to dry fire.
Yep.
Having a loaded gun when we don't intention or intend to do, and discharging rounds when we don't intend to, and that's a problem. It's a safety problem. Big time.
Absolutely. So yeah. that's 100%. Point A is just accept that this could happen to you, and this is not just about irresponsibility. This is a conversation about how to be extra cautious, so that even when you act reasonably and responsibly, you still mitigate risk that is absolutely present despite your best efforts.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, really what you're getting at here is another popular topic when talking about such things is the attitude or the idea of complacency. That complacency is something that sets in when one, typically with someone who is knowledgeable about a particular thing, but because they're knowledgeable, ego creeps in a little bit, a belief that, well, I know this thing and, I'm infallible. I can't make mistakes. And you get lax in your attitude. You get lax in your approach. You get lax with following policies and procedures. I mean, this happens in so many examples in life, so many areas. I've seen it happen. I mean, I've experienced personally, like in the workplace, where you're working in a potentially dangerous job and you get complacent because, you do the same thing all the time, and you might even do it without perfectly following the safety procedures, but because you get away with it for 500 or 1,000 times, you think no big deal. But all it takes is that one time, and then all heck breaks loose. I mean, it reminds me of my accident on a job site years ago, falling off a roof and getting really badly hurt. That was a moment of 100% complacency, of not being 100% focused in the moment, and also not following certain safety protocols.
Yeah, I think you're right. Complacency is a factor. It's part of that mindset aspect, and
yeah,
and repetition does lead to a blind eye.
Yep. This is one of the reasons why we teach the safety rules like we do. So rule number 1 is know the condition of your firearm. Okay. And treat it like a potentially dangerous tool. Always treat it like a potentially dangerous tool. That first piece, like, that is an absolute. It's an absolute statement. Know the condition of your firearm. If we always knew the condition, then it'd be pretty hard to have a negligent discharge. When in doubt, check. Like, you need to have knowledge. But even with that, we still have things in place. That's why the other rules also exist. That's also why some of the things we're going to talk about today, including some of the tools that we'll talk about, also exist, because it's that extra fallback. But even with the tools, and that's the other thing. This kind of goes with like the whole safety first fallacy. The idea is that we sometimes try to make certain professions or workplaces so safe, and we preach the attitude of safety first, that it can, the unintended consequence of that can be that we place too much faith in the safety first concept and in the protections we put in place, that we forget that there's still a personal responsibility that exists. And that is knowing the condition of your firearm at all times.
That's right. Yeah, just got to know.
Yeah. Okay, cool. So avoid denial, accept risk and responsibility and vulnerability.
Yep.
What's next?
Unloaded is good. Inert is better.
Mm.
So I think it's a general consensus, for obvious reasons, that in order to dry fire safely, a person has to unload the gun. And probably you've been told, unload it once, check it a second time, triple check it. Got to have an unloaded gun, right? That's essential, core, and obvious as far as dry fire goes. In order for it to be dry fire, the gun has to be unloaded. So I think that most people are aware of that conceptually, and hopefully have a good habit built around unloading it and then checking it again. And certainly an unloaded gun is not going to fire, right? I mean, it's dry is dry. But the problem comes because an unloaded gun can get reloaded during the course of dry fire practice or exercises, right? Any number of things can happen that cause a round to be seated. Now, I have been collecting dry fire ND stories for the last several months. And reviewing them and reading them and trying to understand what are the common patterns and things that happen. And I'm telling you, people accidentally reload the gun every single time there's an ND during dry fire, because that's the only way for there to be an ND in dry fire, is for the gun to get reloaded at some point. And so while, yes, we need to unload it, like absolutely, an unloaded gun, super important. I think that the higher law of this, the next step here, is to make the gun inert, to make it so the gun can't rechamber and fire a round while you're conducting the dry fire, right? To remove the human element, potential mistake of reloading the gun by temporarily rendering the gun inert. And I think, we're going to talk about several different methods by which that could be done. But I think that's step 2 here. Like in the ultimate guide to dry fire safety, it's, hey, yes, of course, unload the gun, but then render it inert. Make it impossible for the gun to be accidentally reloaded.
Yeah. I think some people look at different options that exist for inert dry fire practice or training and think, well, I'm already short on funds. I just bought my first gun, let's say, and I just don't have a lot of extra disposable income to buy this or that to have this, to make it even more safe for, say, dry fire practice by making it inert in some fashion. And so I think, everybody's got to start someplace. The good news is there are some solutions to making most guns that people are actually doing dry fire practice with inert for very, very, very low cost. And that's a good thing. And that's part of, I think some of the methods we're going to talk about here today.
Yeah, and there's lots of ways that can be done. I mean, obviously, you could do it. You could try and do it really cheap, but it might remove some of the functionality of the gun. Like I know some people who will stick something in the ejection port to keep the slide from coming forward all the way into battery. That's the cost of a toothpick. But the problem is that then your trigger is also dead and you can't use the trigger. So there's a variety of ways to do that. I'll actually take the opposite approach, and I'll start on the expensive end, and we can both throw out some ideas here. But you could buy a dedicated training gun.
Mm-hmm.
So something like a SIRT pistol, for example, or you could buy a real gun and just dedicate it to training by disabling the gun effectively, like removing a firing pin or any number of other things that are known to reliably make the gun inert. So those would be really, certainly buying a secondary gun and just using it for dry fire would be a very expensive route to go.
Mm-hmm.
Buying a dedicated training tool like a SIRT pistol is not nearly as expensive price buying a second gun, depending on the gun you have. But that's still probably a $200 to $400 product. So it's not inexpensive. I'll give one more that's kind of in this price category, and that would be the Cool Fire Trainer, which you and I both like. The Cool Fire Trainer is a great product. It replaces the barrel and the recoil spring in your semi-automatic handgun, and it's a red barrel, so it's very identifiable. You can see that the gun has been rendered inert when you see that color barrel through the ejection port, and it's absolutely 100% inert. The Cool Fire Trainer installed makes that gun incapable of chambering around into the chamber. It just won't feed. So those are all, a Cool Fire Trainer, to throw out a cost, is probably $250 plus. Depending on stuff. So that gives some ideas that are on the more expensive end of ways you can render the gun inert, or just use an inert gun that can't be rendered live.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that was actually exactly where my mind was starting with this. When you talked about expensive end too, was the dedicated training gun. I'll give you some strategies or ways people make dedicated guns inert. First of all, there is... and I've known some people have actually taken firing pins, sometimes in some cases new ones, but in some cases used ones. Like maybe this is a gun that, like a dedicated dry fire gun, it makes actually a lot of sense to take maybe one of your older, more worn guns, and like, hey, I've already got 40,000 rounds through this. Let's say, maybe that becomes the dedicated dry fire gun now, while its mate, a lot of times it makes sense when this dedicated dry fire gun is identical to maybe your carry gun or a competition gun, if that's why you do a lot of dry fires for competition purposes, or both. and take that used gun. You can take the firing pin, remove it from the striker safety, or excuse me, the striker assembly or firing pin assembly, and actually like cut the tip of the firing pin off, and boom, instant. Like, actually, other than the cost of the gun itself, like there's no additional cost. You just are taking an existing part and chopping something off, and now all of a sudden it can't fire around. Also, you could do certain things like, I know I heard of one gentleman that took, it was a very well used gun, very worn. In fact, he even talked about how the barrel that was in it was pretty worn, like the rifling and the grooves in the rifling was pretty worn. And so he had a welder, and he just actually welded the chamber on it, just added some weld in there, and all instantaneously, you can't get around a chamber into the gun. So very, very simple solutions that you can do when you don't mind maybe modifying or destroying a part of the gun to make it inert. So, but I do recognize that's an expensive proposition for a lot of folks to dedicate a whole second gun for dry fire. I would say that I'm finally at a place where I kind of am able to do that. I mean, for instance, I have my main competition gun, and I have a backup competition gun. Well, the backup always lives with a barrel block installed in it. So that becomes the dedicated dry fire gun, because it's then I just leave it set up and it's ready to go. And, so, and my carry gun is basically the same gun or same type of gun as my competition gun. So kind of it's the same sort of thing. So
Yeah.
but that's an expensive proposition.
Yeah, let's go to the barrel block since you mentioned that one, and then we'll throw out some options that are in the middle price range.
Sure.
But a barrel block is $13 plus shipping. Yeah, $12.99 plus shipping. And the barrel block's really nice because it's easy to install. You don't have to disassemble anything. You just lock the slide to the rear, shove that thing in through the ejection port into the chamber, and it'll protrude out the muzzle of the gun. It's caliber specific. It absolutely 100% renders the gun inert. Like there's a round will not be chambered. That gun will not fire when the barrel block is installed. And unlike some of these other things that we're describing, a nice thing about the barrel block being at only $13 is you do have a visual indicator. That barrel block protruding from the end of the muzzle is something you can see. So that if you're Riley, you know that that's the one that you use for dry fire as opposed to the one that doesn't have the orange stick sticking out. Or whatever it might be. And also barrel block at that $12.99 at that $13 price point comes with 3 mag blocks, which are convenient. They're an incremental additional potential safety value, but they also allow for some realistic, the added realism because the slide's not going to lock back if you practice a mag change or something like that. So yeah, for $13, that's the cheapest, probably most foolproof method without some sort of modification to a gun that can't be undone to render a gun inert.
Yeah.
And then in the middle, I said I'd mention some middle price point options. A laser thing, cartridge thingy. Like probably most well known by the laser ammo brand because they're kind of the first to market with something like that. But now there's a lot of products that are very comparable under different names. Riley and I tend to use the laser dot from readyupgear.com, but something like that renders the gun inert. I've done testing on this. Like I've stuck this thing in the gun. I've used a couple different guns to test this, and then I put dummy ammo in the magazine and I attempt to chamber a round. It's just not going to happen. The laser cartridge renders the gun inert. Now that's probably in the range of $60 to $100, depending on where you buy it from and what you get. And then another option in that kind of ballpark is the dry fire mag. I was looking to see if I have my dry fire mag here handy. I don't. But the dry fire mag is a replacement magazine that makes it so that you can get repeated presses of the trigger without having to cycle a slide on a semi-automatic. It's not available for all guns, and so maybe that's one reason it's maybe not as popular, but it is available for some of the more popular guns, and so that's one you could check, and it's in the $100 price range.
Yep. Cool. Yeah. So we've covered the high end on inert training options, low end. The barrel block, I think, is frankly one of the best products out there, period, for dry fire, just because it does its job so exceedingly well, and it's so value priced. It's really hard to go wrong with it. I mean, you mentioned like say laser cartridges, right? Technically, they make the gun inert while they're installed. However, a laser cartridge can fall out.
Sure. Yeah,
right?
Valid. Yeah.
And so there's a little bit greater potential for failure to occur there if you're not paying attention, to where you could potentially end up with that falling out. You don't realize it. You also don't somehow realize you stick a loaded mag in it, and all of a sudden you have a problem. A lot of the Ready Up Gear laser dot trainer cartridges, which is what we sell, what we recommend to use. They and they're very, very similar to a lot of the other similar products that are on the market, but they have these little rubber O-rings that are what are supposed to retain them in the chamber, and those over time do wear out or stretch or get thinner. And so you want to be making sure you're staying on top of those and replacing them as necessary. And actually, I don't know if a lot of people know this, but there's a Ready Up Gear laser dot trainer maintenance kit or whatever it's called. That
it's like $1.50 or $2. You'll pay more for shipping than you will for the maintenance kit. But it comes replacement O-rings and batteries.
Yeah, it comes with a set of batteries and O-rings, and it is reasonably priced. So I recommend if you're going to buy a laser dot trainer, like buy a couple of those little maintenance kits along with it, because they're pretty inexpensive and you're going to be set for a good while. So
yep. Yeah, those are good thoughts. I've said this before, and so I'll just say this and then get off my little bandwagon, or my shameless plug, if you want to call it that. every gun owner in America who has any degree of seriousness about using their firearm on any sort of regular basis should own a barrel block for $13. There's just really no excuse to not own and use a barrel block when appropriate.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep. Yeah. One other thing I'll throw out in this kind of category, although it doesn't necessarily make things inert, but I think it, well, actually, you know what? I'll save this because I see we're going to talk about redundancy, and maybe I'll save this for the redundancy part of our discussion. I think it'll fit in there well. Did we cover all?
Tease.
What's that?
That's a good tease.
Oh, good. Now we covered high-end solutions. We covered kind of low-end to somewhat intermediate. Was there anything else that we missed in the middle there?
There's some, I mean, I'm sure there's some things I'm not thinking of off the top of my head, but I think we did some pretty good stuff there. We talked about barrel block. We talked about laser cartridge insert thingies. We talked about dry fire mag. We talked about cool fire trainer. We talked about cert or other, dedicated type training guns. And we talked about just having a separate dedicated real firearm that you've altered or changed in some way.
I know. Because it's sitting here on my desk and I was like, oh yeah, I meant to talk about this. Here would be another, I guess, intermediate option. And that is a airsoft or an airsoft pistol. That's basically a copy of, or at least a similar enough copy of your actual gun. So in this case, this is not an airsoft one. This is actually a BB pistol, or pellet gun or whatever. It's never actually had pellets or BBs loaded into it. Honestly, I prefer probably the airsoft version. I have some airsoft guns that fill a similar purpose, but this is another option. So I actually have been using this, although it's not the airsoft one, but the pellet one. I've been using this for some dry fire lately. The trigger's a little different, but it's acceptable. Like, this is the only way I could reasonably afford a dedicated kind of airsoft style gun with a red dot on it, so I could do a little bit of red dot practice with a gun like this. So that'd be another option. Also,
to make myself feel better, I'll just say that would have been included in my dedicated training gun category.
Oh, yeah, but these are not anywhere as close to as expensive as for instance, like you can get some airsoft guns that are really pretty good copies of real guns for like 120 to 150.
Yeah, it really depends on the gun, right? Like I'm on the Elite Force website right now, which is a division of Umarex. And, I can go get a Glock 19 Gen 3 BB gun for $79.99. I can get a Glock 17 Gen 3 BB gun for $189. So yeah.
Yeah, intermediate range.
Yeah.
One other final thought, for this would be more on the lower end side, would be things that you can do or use a blue gun for. So you don't have to use an actual live gun all the time for dry fire practice. But if you were just going to work on, say, draw, for instance, and this is a great idea, a great suggestion when you're working, say, from a new holster, just to make it even safer. Like, hey, if you're just working on draw, you're just working on getting reps on that holster, we'll use a blue gun. And those are, of course, absolutely 100% inert.
Yep. That's a good thought.
Cool. Let's talk about dry fire location.
Yeah, I think this is also a fairly well-known dry fire safety tip, but we would be remiss to not include it in this conversation, right? The ultimate dry fire safety guide. So the idea here being that you always do dry fire in the same place, and that place be a maintained clean environment. And by clean, we specifically mean that live ammunition doesn't go there. So some people might call this like a dry fire dojo, right? Maybe it's a dedicated room in the house or a corner of the basement or whatever it might be. And that's the place that I go to do my dry fire. Maybe I got some targets set up. Maybe that's where my dry fire gear is. But I make sure I go to some effort to keep that space clean of live ammunition, right? That I make sure when I walk into that space, live ammo doesn't come with me, so that I just nip in the butt any potential possibility that live ammunition is in the same place as me when I'm conducting dry fire. That's, I think, the broad concept.
Yeah. I think the first time I heard, at least for me personally, maybe it existed before this, I don't know. But the first time I think I heard the dry fire dojo phrase or terminology was from our friend Annette Evans in her dry fire primer book. where she certainly talks about it, or she gives it a good couple of pages in her book about a dry fire, setting up a dry fire dojo or dry fire studio, I think was another term she gave it. And I really think this is a great idea because, like you just said, the idea is that this room, this space, this area, my garage, whatever it is set aside as my dry fire dojo. That's where I put the dry fire tools, as far as whether it's my STIRT gun or airsoft gun or whatever. That's where I put my dry fire targets, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And that the live gun or the loaded gun or the live ammo does not cross the threshold of that dry fire dojo. And that is the key. That is the key. And you live by that. You abide by that. You make that a policy in your life that the dry fire dojo is sacred. I mean, I came up in my youth. I did a little bit of karate in my youth for a time. And then the family moved, and I no longer had access to the dojo that I had come up in, and I never picked up karate after that again, at least not karate. I've done a little bit of some other stuff, but I remember one of the first lessons that I learned going there was this was the dojo where we trained, right? And one thing that did not come into the dojo was shoes, street shoes, right? So it's kind of like same idea. I also spent some time living in Japan, right? And in their homes, there's the threshold, and like the entry area part of their home that they refer to as the genkan. That's where your shoes stop. You come into the genkan, street shoes come off. A lot of times you'll have slippers that you would wear or sandals or something you wear inside the home, or maybe you just go bare feet or socks. But the shoes stop at the genkan. They do not come into the house. So I think that's where, like, the dry fire dojo, I really like that terminology because it just totally makes sense in my world that it's like sort of this inner sanctum, sacred place, and in our context, the live ammo does not enter the dojo.
Yeah, and a lot of the negligent discharge dry fire stories that I've collected are situations where someone was effectively too lazy or too short on time to go to the dojo.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Oh, I'm waiting for the family. I'm sitting here at the kitchen table. We're going to leave in 10 minutes. I want to get a couple quick reps in. So I'll just, drop the mag, clear the chamber, and do some reps. And my live ammo, I got it out of the gun. I loaded it, but it's just sitting here next to me, Or I got one from a range master who's at the gun range in his office, and he's got a few minutes before his next appointment. A student's going to come in for a class or something like that. And so he's got a few minutes. He's like, just get some quick dry fire in, right? So he drops the mag, clears the chamber, and starts to do some dry fire. Both of those stories start with, I don't want to go to the effort. I don't have the time to go to the effort to go somewhere to my dojo, to that place where I normally, to clean the environment of live ammunition. I'm just going to get some quick reps in. Both those stories end with negligent discharges of rounds being fired off.
Mm-hmm.
So like, yes, have the dojo, make sure it's a clean environment, treat it with that kind of respect, and make it a hard, like, non-breakable rule. But along with that, then has to go this attitude or this follow-up sub-rule of, that's where I conduct dry fire, right? It doesn't do me any good to have this awesome place set up and to make sure that's a clean environment. Never let live ammo into that place if I'm just too lazy to go there every time I want to do some dry fire. Mm-hmm. So that's part of that, right? It's got to be, yes, I'm going to have this environment. I'm going to make sure it's a clean environment. I'm never going to allow live ammunition in there. And that's the only place I'm going to conduct dry fire with my my real gun. With a real gun.
Yeah. Yeah. Now, we recognize it may not always be possible for everybody to have a dedicated dry fire dojo. Although I do think with some good thought, I think you can probably figure out your own equivalent of something like that. But again, regardless, everybody's situation and circumstances are different. And so, use critical thinking and figure out what makes most sense for you that you're able to do. And whatever it is you come up with, just make sure that, like, this is the policy, and I'm going to stick to that. There's something else that comes straight out of Annette's book, Dry Fire Primer, that I think is an excellent suggestion, where she talks about when you are done dry firing, because like one common, and I've certainly heard of this being an issue. This happens, I think, probably more frequently than we even realize, is where someone's doing dry fire and they're doing a great job doing the dry fire piece safely, but then they get done, and because they're practicing with their carry gun or whatever, they go back to a loaded condition, and strap it back on. Like, okay, dry fire's done for today. Load up my gun, back in the holster, and a mental lapse occurs, and a minute or two later, they're like, oh, you just got done doing this. And if you do dry fire well, you do it right, it can be fun and enjoyable. And it's like, oh, I just want to do one more rep, and you grab the gun and you go out and bang. And so the suggestion she makes is, well, there's two. One is, it's maybe not a bad idea to verbally actually say out loud, I am now done dry firing, or I have completed dry fire. The other thing that I think is actually probably a little bit more effective is to actually set the gun aside for like 10 minutes and do something else entirely, and take your mind completely away from what you were just doing in dry fire. Give it a solid 10 minutes before you do anything else with that gun. And I think that's actually not a bad idea.
Yeah.
So there's definitely some various approaches that can be done here. Now,
I like the verbal. I'm sorry, go ahead. I like and I've had people tell me they do this. I like the idea of a verbal announcement at start and end. Mm-hmm. Just starting dry fire over. I know someone also who puts up a sign, almost like it's like if you're in a studio and you've got the signs like live, we're on the air, the on-air sign kind of thing, like same kind of idea. Like, they put up the dry fire sign, like I'm doing dry fire. And maybe that's for also the benefit of someone else who might wander into the environment and see you, doing your thing. But then sign comes down, right? Like these other like things that you do that signal to your brain, and maybe others in the environment as well, to like, now's my start, or now's my end time. I'm done now. I think all that's valid.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very good. Forgot what the other little piece was I was going to throw in there as we kind of start talking over each other. So maybe they'll come back.
Well, this is a nice segue into my next thought here.
Yeah, no, I was thinking that as well.
So I think it's really important to have a hard start and a hard stop with dry fire. So maybe 100% of the time, but certainly at the very least a high percentage of the time, in the stories I've collected from people who have had an ND during dry fire, a very large amount of the time, the ND immediately follows a distraction. So conducting dry fire, distraction happens, resume dry fire, negligent discharge happens. That's a very, very common pattern, like at least 9 out of 10. So clearly distractions are a problem. And you can't avoid distractions entirely, by the way. Like phone starts ringing. Oh, I'll leave the phone in a different room. The dog starts barking. Your wife walks in and asks you a question, or your husband, should you be a woman, whatever it is. No judgment. But the point is, like, distractions are not completely unavoidable. They can happen. And so there's got to be this like hard start, hard stop approach where I make a decision. I'm going to now start dry firing, right? And so I'm going to follow the routine that I have in place for my dry fire, whatever that is, right? If it's installing the barrel block, or if it's setting up some targets, or it's putting the ammo over here in this room as I go into this, whatever the thing is, I set some routine in place that this is what I do when I start dry fire. So this is my start. I'm starting now, so I'm going to follow that routine, and I'm going to begin to engage. And then I need to have a similar hard stop. And if a distraction occurs, that's my stop. That's got to be my stop, right? Dog starts, my wife walks in the room like, hey, I want to talk to you about such as. I was like, okay, hold on. I got to stop. I need to put a hard stop in this. So give me a second. Or maybe it's, hey, I just fell down the stairs and I'm bleeding. I got to start running now. right? So I got to determine in that moment, though, that my dry fire session is over. It's done. I'm not going to resume when I get back, because it's just an extraordinary pattern that the large percentage of these NDs during dry fire occur immediately following some sort of distraction. I'll give you just a couple of tangible examples, then Riley, I'm sure you have some comments. But one of them, a guy sitting at his kitchen table conducting some dry fire, and he gets a phone call from his dad. He'd been waiting to hear from his dad. His dad's had some medical issues, had been out, he had a doctor's appointment that day, and so he was waiting for an update from his dad. Dad calls, got to take the call, right? Not going to deny Dad. It's really important we talk to Dad. So he takes the call, right? And while he's on the phone, he's like, okay, I think I'm family, I need to be done. So he goes ahead and reloads the gun, holsters up, gets done with the phone call with Dad, right? And somehow there's just the lapse in the brain that doesn't say, oh, by the way, you reloaded your gun while you were on the phone, right? So he goes ahead and puts the phone down and resumes dry fire, and it ain't dry. And another similar one with the range master one I talked about earlier. Same concept, was conducting dry fire. Someone comes in the office, asks a question. He determines, I probably, should we go ahead and be done now? So reloads the gun. Person leaves the office, decides, hey, I'm going to get a couple more reps in. Bang, right? So obviously, if you've already done all the things we've talked about leading up till now, that would be very difficult, because you've cleaned the environment, you've put the ammunition somewhere, all that other stuff. But without any question, distractions are a common problem that lead to NDs. And I think the way to best mitigate them is to have a hard start process, some sort of system procedure is the best word, some sort of hard start procedure, and a hard stop procedure, and to recognize that the second a distraction occurs, that's your hard stop. You're done now. Like you're not going to start later. It's over now.
Yeah. Oh yeah, this is exactly what I was touching on a moment ago with respect to, the attitude that sometimes a person will get done dry firing, load up their gun with live ammo again, their carry ammo, let's say, and then like a moment later they go back to doing dry fire. It's a very real risk. This is why I think the concept of a dry fire dojo works so well, because if you only dry fire while in the dojo, and if you only have live ammo outside of the dojo, then part of your hard start, hard stop procedure becomes that I unload my gun outside the dojo. I go in the dojo. I do the dry fire thing. When I'm done, and that includes if I get interrupted in the middle of that. Like, let's say I, for some reason, have to leave the dojo area. Well, it's fine to leave with an unloaded gun, right? But what you don't do is you don't dry fire outside the dojo. You didn't get distracted and then leave the dojo, and while you're out wherever you are, do dry fire again. No, if you're going to continue doing practice draws or whatever, you go back to the dojo. Meanwhile, if you left the dry fire dojo because you got distracted, you got called away, whatever, and while you're out there, you mindlessly load up the gun, you go back into the dojo, right? Like, and by the way, you should have the same procedure when you go back into dojo. What's part of the procedure?
It's the hard start.
Checking the gun again. Exactly. It's, well, I'm going into dry fire dojo, going to do dry fire. The procedure is, before stepping across that threshold, check my gun, check my equipment. So yes, you're exactly right. Like, these two concepts tie together very, very, very well. If it's executed like we're talking about here, it's pretty hard to screw up. If you, I mean, like, you will make a mistake by not following the procedure, but if you always follow the procedure, it's pretty hard to make a mistake.
Yeah. Build a procedure around the start, build a procedure around the stop. If anything happens mid-session, that's your stop. And if you want to resume later, you have to start the whole thing from scratch. You got to restart whatever your normal start procedure is. And correlating all that with the clean room, with the dojo concept, I think is super valid. Good stuff.
Yeah. Now, the one thing that I did remember that I said I'd forgotten about a moment ago, was this is kind of an alternate viewpoint, which I was introduced to not that long ago, and I found it intriguing then, and I still find it intriguing now. I say intriguing because I don't know quite yet what to make of it, although I understand the mental attitude about it. And what that is I have been told by a few folks, I think more often than not, people abide by sort of the dry fire dojo approach. But I've been told now by a couple of folks that believe in the idea of they unload the gun and they keep the loaded ammo right where they can see it. And like even one individual I know of has a special, we'll call it a tray or small box that their live ammo, like say their carry ammo for their carry gun that they maybe are doing dry fire with, it goes in that box and it is in the box and is visible and is like they know where it is and they can account for it. And by nature of it being accountable, like it's hard to accidentally end up with it in the gun. It's kind of the idea. I'm not saying I subscribe to this idea. I'm just saying I've heard that school of thought given, and I find it intriguing.
I think it has merit.
Yeah.
I think it has merit.
I prefer the dojo approach. I have a family room in my basement that is my dry fire dojo. I have targets pasted up on all four walls that fortunately now my wife has just gotten used to, and she just ignores them, which is great. But there was a time where it was like, are you ever going to take those down? It's like, why? You know, it just costs me extra work, you know, like you're not down here that often anyway. You know, so it's like I just have the targets up, and like that space is the dojo. So
she's a good woman. Yeah, I determine, like, if you're listening to this and you're like, this all sounds great, maybe you're just now thinking about getting really more dedicated to dry fire practice and doing this more often, maybe, you know, for any reason that might be. Build your procedure and write it down. Like, don't be, it's like, I'm not saying like put it up on the wall, though that may not be a bad idea, but I do think there's value to committing something to paper. You know, when I conduct dry fire, I will do the following. You know, maybe I'm going to have that verbal command. I'm going to say out loud, you know, starting dry fire, I'm going to, you know, put live ammo in X place. I'm going to conduct my dry fire in this place. I'm going to, you know, whatever it is, like, you know, build out your procedure and write it down. Okay. And then also do the same thing for your stop procedure. When I have a stop, this is going to be what I do. And I think it's okay to personalize it. Like, I don't think you have to follow this stuff word. Like, I'll give you an example, something I do that I wasn't going to bring up, but it's kind of unique to me, is I have a dry fire range bag. I have a range bag with all my dry fire gear. And only thing that goes in that bag is dry fire stuff. There's no live ammo in that bag. Real guns don't go in that bag. It's just dry fire gear. So I may not conduct dry fire in the same place every time. I'm a person who does not have a dry fire dojo, but I do grab that bag. That bag becomes part of my start procedure. I grab the dry fire range bag. I can see it. It's right over there on the floor. And I grab that bag, and that's kind of part of that mental cue. It's like, okay, this is going to be the stuff I use for dry fire. And if I'm going to use my carry gun, then I have a procedure for that as well, right? This is what I'm going to do, but I'm not going to take the ammo out and put it in my dry fire range bag. I don't know. It just works for me. Like, for me and my process, I like having a specific range bag for all my dry fire stuff. So you can personalize it, but I do think there's value in putting it on paper and making sure you're clear that you built a procedure and you're going to follow it.
Yeah. Yeah. I think you're definitely in the minority, the vast minority, but I actually don't think you're the only person that has like a dry fire range bag, if you will.
Well, I probably have more dry fire crap
than most people.
Sure, that's the nature of being in the industry and selling these products and, you know, buying competing products to test them and whatever. But yeah, and it's also, as a firearm instructor, there's value to me having a dry fire range bag. I could take it to certain types of classes that are classroom only, and I know that, you know, this bag is safe stuff that I can take to the classroom.
Yeah.
So yeah, it may not be a
Yeah.
piece of advice for everybody, but I offer it just as an example of something that's unique to me that I do that works for me.
Yeah. And I think it makes a lot of sense to have that dedicated bag, especially if you have like a dedicated dry fire pistol.
Mm-hmm.
And then you'd have maybe some dedicated mags, some dedicated, dummy ammo. I mean, like having all the tools in one place, I think there's a lot of sense that makes. Speaking of dedicated mags, and I'm going to use this as an opportunity to go into our last point of discussion, which has to do with redundancy. And I would say this is almost a form of redundancy. It doesn't become its own solution for making a gun inert, but I think there's something to be said about having dedicated dry fire magazines for your dry fire gun. Even if you don't have a dedicated gun, see, it's a little bit more affordable to, magazines cost less, obviously, than a full gun. So you could have some dedicated magazines. That way you are never crossing over, and this could be true in the case of like a dry fire dojo setup where live ammo and live mags you use for your carry gun or whatever stay outside the dojo, and you have dedicated magazines for within the dojo. But then having dedicated magazines that are only used for dry fire, they could be marked a certain way, they could be written on, they could be painted, whatever, or have a different color base pad or base plate than your normal mags. And then you could also have dedicated dummy ammo that goes along with those as well. I suppose you could always leave them loaded with dummy ammo, but it probably wouldn't necessarily be a bad idea to like always verify that the dummy ammo that you actually have with you or in your mags or in your dry fire area is actually, in fact, dummy ammo. I have heard of people thinking, like for instance, and I do the same thing as far as like I have a baggie with dummy ammo in it. Okay. And the thing I've heard of happening is that somebody ends up, so like they have this pouch, this baggie or whatever of dry fire ammo or dummy ammo. And then at some point, somehow a live round gets mixed in and they don't notice. But, you look at it and at a glance, you might not catch that there's a live round mixed in there because they all kind of look somewhat similar. Even when you have dummy rounds that are a different color, very obvious different color than a live round, the live round still sometimes can get lost in the mix and kind of blend in. I think where there's a potential for this to happen, because you might ask, well, how would I end up with live ammo mixed in with the dummy ammo? Well, do you ever use dummy ammo at the live fire range?
Well, you
do
should.
you do drills, malfunction drills at the range? You're mixing in some dummy ammo with your live ammo. Well, in the course of that, it's possible that as you are doing malfunction practice at the live fire range and you're picking up dummy rounds off the ground, that you accidentally pick up live rounds along with the dummy rounds that you're trying to pick up, and for whatever reason not notice that. Or this might be more common in the case for some of us that are like instructors, and maybe you're working with students and students are using dummy rounds, maybe you're lending them to them or whatever over the course of a day, and they're picking things up and handing it back to you. You need to be accountable for that stuff and inspect it.
Well,
And
I find
so,
live rounds on the ground at the range all the time, and I pick them up. I'm like, ooh, free ammo.
oh yeah, sure. Well, I don't ever shoot the stuff I pick up.
I do.
Jacob likes to live on the wild side, so
I absolutely do.
So
yeah, I really like your idea of dedicated mags for dry fire. I never thought about that before. Actually, I'm really glad you brought that up. I'm going to put that on my little list I have over here. And because I have now for maybe the last couple of years, I can't remember who gave me the idea, but I do kind of have dedicated carry mags that are pretty sacred. I don't want them hitting the concrete or getting in the dirt. So those are sacred carry mags. And then I kind of retire mags to be my training mags. And you're giving me the idea that I could retire training mags to be my dry fire mags, and mark them accordingly.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah. So there you go. That would be another thought there. Now I want to hear some more of your thoughts with regards to redundancy.
I wanted to point out something about the dummy ammo before we get off that topic, because you mentioned that you should check them out because, the eyes see what they expect to see. So maybe you expect to see, bright orange or yellow or shiny maroon, whatever, and you just don't notice that it's actually a live round. But this is also an argument for making sure you're using high visibility dummy ammo, as opposed to somebody who's a cheap son of a gun and they just take an actual round and drill out the primer or something and dump the powder. I've seen people just remove primers and powder and say, poof, yeah, now it's a dummy round. And they do that because maybe it's more realistic shaped. It's weighted maybe a little bit more realistically, but it's so much easier than if that's the dummy rounds I'm using in dry fire. It makes it a lot easier to screw up and accidentally load a live round because it looks the exact same. So anyway, I just wanted to highlight that's also a good argument for making sure your dummy ammo is highly distinguishable. If it's not already.
Yeah, I think primarily where I've seen people use we'll call it reloaded ammo for dummy rounds, meaning like they just put a actual bullet in a empty once fired case, no primer in it, whatever, is those. And I think this is a valid thing to do. I see it a little bit more commonly amongst competition shooters because they tend to care about this a little bit more. And I'm not saying that defensive oriented folks shouldn't care about this with respect to reload practice, but it's really good to practice reloads with weighted magazines. And what I mean is the competition folks tend to really care about that practice mag being like pretty much exactly the same weight as what a real one would be. And so they'll fashion their own dummy rounds, so to speak, from reloads, so they can actually have practice magazines that are true to weight. And so that's a viable thing. But you're not wrong with respect to like using high vis dummy rounds is a good idea.
It's
now,
safer.
I do know some folks that will, like, let's say they reload their ammo anyway. That's very common amongst competition shooters. And let's say that you always buy blue bullets and, for whatever reason like that. And there's actually there's a brand that's called Blues Bullets, and that's the actual color of their bullets. Let's say the ones you actually shoot in competition are blue. Well, you could actually buy red ones or yellow ones or green ones, something that's totally different, that is your dry fire simulated ammo. And by the way, some of you are like, really? Like, there's all these different colors. If you're not familiar, a lot of reloaders will use cast lead bullets that have been polymer coated. And you can get that polymer coating material from, you can get it in any color you want. And a lot of the companies that sell bullets for reloading purposes for competition shooters specifically, because it's so popular amongst them, will sell bullets in a variety of colors. So anyway, I just present that as a alternative thought, just to give some people some things to think on. But I'll say for myself, loading up my practice mags fully with ready up gear dummy rounds is close enough to actual weight for me. Man, maybe that's why I'm not quite, Rob Latham level yet, but I don't think so. But I'm perfectly happy with the weight of my magazines with actual dummy ammo loaded into them.
Yeah, good stuff. Last thought from me, and I know we're running out of time, but I just wanted to highlight that if you might be listening to this and thinking, wow, man, like if you just do one of those things, isn't that enough? Or I already do this, so I don't need to do that also. I already have a dojo. I don't have live ammo. So is it really important that I make my gun inert? Or I already make my gun inert. So does it really matter if I have a dojo, or does it really matter if I, have dedicated mags, or does it really matter if I remove live ammo since I've shoved a barrel block in it, whatever. Like, do I have to have a procedure if I just always do XYZ thing? Right. So you might be tempted to feel like, well, I already do one of these things, or something that I feel is just as good. Is it really important I do all 6 or 10 or however many of these things that we've discussed today? And my answer to that is yes. Like, fundamentally, firearm safety has always been about redundancy, as safety generally in most arenas and professions and industries is about redundancy, right? The idea that if I fail to do one thing, I'll be okay because we still have these other things I'm doing that I'd have to screw up several times over in order to actually have the accident, right? So just bear that in mind, that applies here too, that redundancy is a good thing. And it's okay to do 3 or 4 things that all equally so significantly reduce the risk of negligent discharge down to almost 0.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree with that. Redundancy is a good thing where safety is involved. And even, like, I wouldn't even necessarily, I think a lot of what we've talked about today are really excellent ideas, but I would also say that you don't necessarily have to do all the things that we recommended or that we talked about. But if you do some of them and you have some redundancy across your system, your way of conducting dry fire practice, that's good, because that you have certain things in place and then you have things kind of backing up those things. And typically, and this is typically true of a lot of accidents that occur, is that it's usually not just one violation that occurs, safety violation. It's usually multiple things that fail. And that's almost what makes these types of accidents, when they do occur, like truly unfortunate, is because multiple failures had to occur for it to happen. And it really goes to show just how far we as non-perfect human beings are able and or willing to go to make mistakes. And that's unfortunately the nature of being human, is that we're inherently lazy creatures a lot of times. And so, it's easy to get stuck in a rut. It's easy to get complacent. It's easy to make excuses. It's easy to get distracted and have your mind somewhere else. And so have redundancies and do everything you can to follow the procedures, and it should keep you safe. Mm-hmm. The final thing I'll add here, I have it here on my notes. I know we are over time, but it's just food for thought. Don't have to spend a lot of time on this. And it's kind of in the form of a question. And that is, why are we always pressing the trigger in dry fire? Okay. See, the inherently dangerous part of dry fire, besides, like, obviously we want to have good practices in place as far as safe direction that we conduct dry fire. Now, we haven't really talked about that much today, which maybe is a bit of an injustice, in that part of an assumption I think that we made with respect to establishing a dry fire dojo, we may have mentioned it, but more in passing, is that you have a safe direction, or you've identified a safe direction in which you point, orient, and conduct the handling of the pistol so that it is done in a safe direction, right? That's one of the redundancies here that we speak of. Some of you might live in a more urban or more urban environment, more city-like environment, where maybe you don't have as well defined a safe direction. Like me here, I'm in a suburban environment, but I have a basement, and that becomes such a easy solution for dry fire, because technically, if there's no one else in the basement with me, all 4 directions are safe. And that's part of my procedure. Is I do dry fire, I have targets on all 4 walls, but I make sure there's nobody downstairs when I do that. And sometimes I might have kids in a neighboring room or something, and I will just do it in the one direction, where there's no ability for anyone to be between me and the wall. Okay, so anyway, that was probably a bit of an unfortunate assumption, I think, as we were focused on some of these other things today. But I think people understand that, right? Have a safe direction. If you're in a more urban environment, you need to do your best to make the least bad choice that becomes your safe direction. And then I would absolutely encourage you to use tools like the barrel block that truly, or any other true inert dry fire tool, because then it becomes really incumbent upon you to ensure that you're being safe, and also you have redundancy in place. But back to my question, why are we always pressing the trigger? I think so many people think dry fire means that I pick up the gun or I draw the gun and I press the trigger, click, and then I reset and I do it again. While I do think that learning your trigger and learning how to manipulate that and how to hold everything really steady as you press the trigger, like that's all valid and important to do. It's not the only thing you should be doing in dry fire. And not only that, should I be practicing to get in the routine where every time I draw my gun, I automatically press the trigger? And I would say no, because we know of plenty. I mean, Matthew and I just did the Justified Saves episode earlier today. We know of plenty of instances where people have stopped violent criminal actors by simply drawing their gun. You know, maybe they were ready to go ahead and fire shots, but they determined they didn't have to. And good on them, because as they were drawing their gun and beginning to address a threat, the threat saw what was occurring and by their own will elected to not continue the violent attack, right? So we shouldn't be automatically wired to draw and press trigger. Okay. So there's some validity there from also a tactical perspective to not necessarily always draw and press trigger, to just get in the habit of drawing and bringing the gun to your eye, picking up a good sight picture based on whatever it is you determine is acceptable in your dry fire environment, and just simply getting a good sight picture. Okay, cool. Maybe even practicing just drawing to a low ready. Not a bad idea either. But the point is there's way more to dry fire than just press click, press click, press click, press click. So that's my final words. I would actually say that, yeah, I think you were muted or something. I would actually say that most days I do dry fire, which is almost every day, I actually don't do that many trigger presses. It's mostly about getting my hand on my gun and getting my sights on target. That's what I care about the most about. The pressing the trigger part for me is the easy part. So the thing that becomes a little bit perishable in terms of skill wise is like how consistent is clear garment, grip to gun, gun up to eye, see sights. So actually probably do more draws without trigger presses than I do with trigger presses. And that might surprise some people.
Makes sense to me.
Well, I hope you enjoyed this episode today. I know I did. I thought this was a good discussion. I thought we covered a lot of important aspects of dry fire practice and doing it safely. We appreciate all of you for participating with us, listening, supporting us, supporting our sponsors, especially. Today's episode was sponsored again by Gunfighter Gun Oil. Again, you can find them at gunfighteroil.com. Please check them out. Give them support because they support us. And also our other sponsor, Ready Up Gear Dummy Ammo specifically, was what we called for here today. But we also mentioned some other Ready Up Gear products in the course of our episode today. You can find them all at readyupgear.com. And we also mentioned Barrel Block, which is a product we sell and have sold for a number of years, and one that we now proudly own. And you can find that at barrelblock.com. So just some things to think about there. And I would also say, I mentioned in the beginning that this episode was brought to you by almost like a title sponsorship of Mountain Medical. Maybe not a bad idea to have your medical stuff nearby when you do dry fire too. If something goes awry, yeah, like I see Jacob sitting on his desk there behind him. Look at that.
Right there.
Yeah. Anyway, guys, thank you for your support. Thank you for your support of our sponsors. Any final parting words, Jacob?
Share this with somebody you know who conducts dry fire. You know, take the link and send it out via email or text it to somebody and say, hey, I thought this was really good. And let's make sure that more people are conducting safe dry fire.
Amen to that. Amen to that. So with that, we will bid you adieu until next week, next time. A reminder to train right, train often, and train safe so you can fight hard, fight fast, and fight true. Take care.